Today, T takes on part 2 of a home office makeover, floating shelves. I get started by breaking down 3/4 inch maple plywood sheets with my circular saw and track. I cut across the plywood, making 3 foot by 4 foot pieces to make it more manageable on the table saw. This is also the first time I get to try out my new Bora Centipede 4x8 work stand. I do have to say, it works really well. At the table saw, I set the fence just shy of 18 inches. I run my 3 foot by 4 foot pieces and cut them in half until I have 6 18 inch by 48 inch pieces. These will be the tops and bottoms to the shelves. Using my Wixie digital angle gauge, I set the blade to 45 degrees to cut the miters onto one edge of each shelf piece and trim the width to 17.5 inches at the same time. I reset the blade back to 90 degrees and rip 1.5 inch strips for the cleats. I set my fence to 4 inches to cut the 3 faces for each shelf. Once again, I adjust my blade to 45 degrees, cut the miters on the long edges, and trim each width to 3 inches. Here's a closer look of how I cut the miters for the faces. It's pretty thin for my liking, but I felt more comfortable and confident with my micro jig and push stick. Just make sure you take precaution when you make your cuts. At the miter saw, I trim down the length of the cleats and boards. Off camera, I take the cleats back and forth to the niche and sneak up on the cuts until they fit perfectly. The final measurements came out to 47 3/8 of an inch. Using my laser level, I hang the rear cleat with 3-inch screws directly into the studs. I then use my Wallabot stud finder to find and mark the studs for the right and left cleats. I make sure to cut the side cleats to size and transfer the stud location to each one. Each side only has one stud to secure a screw, so I add a wall anchor towards the rear of each cleat for additional support. With the cleat secured to the wall, I set the top piece into place. I wanted to finish assembling the bottom shelf first in an attempt to minimize making mistakes for the top 2 shelves, like forgetting to add glue to the top piece before nailing it down. After this realization, I add glue to the bottom piece, hold it in place with clamps, and secure it to the cleats with 1.25 brad nails. I add an 1.5 inch spacer in the middle for additional support to prevent bowing in the future. I secure it with wood glue and brads from underneath. The last step in assembling the shelf is adding the front face. I glue up the mitered edges and secure the face with 1.25 inch brad nails. And with the bottom shelf fully assembled, I call it for the night. The next day is pretty much the same how I ended the night before. Secure the rear cleat directly into the studs with 3-inch screws, mount the side cleats with a screw in one stud and another screw with a wall anchor, set the top piece into place with glue and brad nails, and set the bottom piece with glue and brads with the help of some clamps. I space the middle shelf high enough so that I can place my printer on the bottom shelf and open the scanning bed without interference. I evenly space the top 2 shelves so that there is enough space to easily place 2 storage tubs on top of each other. I saved assembling the front faces for last, and this is also where I make another blunder. I was so excited to put these faces on that I forgot to add the 1.5 inch spacer in the middle of the top shelf. Oh well, I think everything should be fine with all the glue and brads in place. I'm also not setting a ton of weight on the top shelf either. With the faces secured, I take a screwdriver and using the shaft, I burnish the corners on the top and bottom of each shelf. This helps close any small gaps between the mitered plywood corners. It's here while I'm putting away things that I realize I forgot to add the spacer for the top shelf. Oh well, the show must go on. I use wood filler to cover up the brad nail holes and any other large voids in the mitered corners. The next day, I sand the dried wood filler with 180 grit sandpaper. I try getting as much as I can with the random orbital sander, but the holes are too close to the walls and just out of reach. I end up having to sand the rest by hand. Next, I mask around the shelves to prepare for stain. Once I'm done masking everything off, I wipe everything down with a tack cloth to ensure I remove any last dust and debris. Whenever I use a stain, I like to precondition my wood even if it is plywood. This may be an extra step to some, but I figure it can't hurt, and in the worst case scenario, it just takes a little bit more time. I always try to get a nice uniform look and avoid any blotches when possible. The stain I'm using is the Minwax Wood Finishing Penetrating Stain in Ebony. I put on a coat, let it soak for about 15 minutes and wipe off the excess. I let it dry for several hours and repeat the process for the second coat. Unfortunately, I forgot to hit record when I applied the second coat, but I think you get the gist. The next day, I apply a shellac finish. Remember, stain only provides color, but not protection. I apply a thin layer of shellac directly onto the surfaces and let it dry for 30 minutes. Then I sand it lightly with 320 grit and a synthetic finishing steel wool pad. I apply a second coat of shellac, but this time it's diluted with a 1-to-2 mix with denatured alcohol. I let it dry for another 30 minutes and do another light sanding. I then apply the last coat with a 1-to-4 mix of denatured alcohol, lightly sand, and wipe off with a tack cloth. With the shellac complete, I apply some paste wax for the final layer of protection. I let it set for about 15 minutes and buff it off. From here, I can remove the masking tape. This step is completely unnecessary. I was originally thinking about masking the shelves so I can caulk the corners and touch up the paint on the walls without making a mess on the shelves. In reality, after I pulled up the tape, it took up some of the caulk and I had to reapply and repaint it. Save yourself the time and trouble, don't bother masking off the shelves, and just apply the caulk directly in the corners and spread it with your finger. Caulk cleans up easily with water, and just take your time in painting. After the caulk dries for 20 minutes, I carefully paint the edges and any other spots or smudges on the wall left from the stain. As the paint is drying, I mask off the back corner and draw a 2x5 inch rectangle for the placement of a recessed power strip with USB ports. This was an afterthought and would have been much easier to cut out prior to installing the shelf. I used my drill, jigsaw, and a handsaw to cut out the necessary section. I use an 1.5-inch Forstner bit to drill out the bottom hole. With that done, I remove the tape, insert the power strip, plug it in, and tuck away the excess cable within the shelf. I can now call this project complete. Here's the completed project. I have my Star Wars Legos up on top, my Marvel things in the middle, and my electronics here on the bottom shelf with room to spare underneath for storage. With the inclusion of the recessed power strip, I'm able to plug in my shredder, printer, MacBook, and camera battery. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next T Takes On.